kick off, and Tim is going to record today's session for us also. So, folks, this is an interesting topic, and it's one that we're following up from our initial webinar a number of months ago, just before Christmas, in fact, where we started looking at the topic of coaching cultures. And I suppose we're following on from where we left off, in the sense that what we noticed, and we had 3 speakers at that event, was in sharing information with our companies, our member companies, and with the coaches themselves. The observation was, you know what, coaching cultures are still a little bit aspirational. So we thought maybe we're at a stage where we need to be looking at coaching readiness rather than assuming that we have that many coaching cultures. And obviously, psychological safety is a concept people are familiar with. It's been around really since the 1960s, but popularized by Amy Redmondson. So the Engineering Skill Net, just to give you a little bit of an introduction on ourselves, we exist since 2021. We're one of IBEC's 10 skill nets. I welcome also participants from the IFS Skill Net. Those members are very welcome here today. The Engineering Skill Net is promoted by the Engineering Industries Ireland Trade Association. Most of our members, actually 63%, are SMEs. But a bit like COVID, I suppose, in that all companies, be they financial services, automotive, aeronautical, whatever the sectors, we're all experiencing some very common needs at the moment and common challenges. And they're around some of our pillars here. First of all, how do we create transferable skills pathways? Because technology is moving at a pace. We're very time poor and we're struggling to keep up with the pace of work. And we're, I suppose, in a way, struggling to identify what are the key skills that we need mostly to promote for the future. And coaching happens to be one of those, what we call transversal skills. It really works well to carry knowledge and concepts across lots of different disciplines. We're also looking at our business transformations. We are hoping to aim for small a agile businesses that can be very resilient and respond to change. And we also want to have achieved our business excellence. And in Ireland, we're very strong when it comes to productivity, but maybe coaching is something that can also help us with perspectivity, so that we interpret well and we look at the big picture. And we need that systems view now with all the reporting and regulatory requirements coming our way. We want to make sure that we promote idea generation and we have creative cultures. And coaching, again, is a skill set that really lends itself well to idea generation, and also, I suppose, the courage to embrace change, because that's not an easy thing for any of our companies. So more and more, we're looking at how do we make our employees future ready and fit for a very complex and abstract world of work. And we're looking at the fact that really it's not so much about what we can do with technology, but much more about what technology should be able to do for us. And there's good and bad news there, in that technology is speeding up the pace that we can work and make us more productive, but it's also having some downsides as well from our cognitive health point of view. And a cognition is simply how we perceive the world and what we believe. And we're finding that there is a little bit of a disconnect these days. The world of work is opening up. We can work from home. And what we're seeing, however, is higher rates of burnout and anxiety, imposter syndrome, and even overwhelm are increasingly prevalent, even at the senior ranks within companies. In fact, managers are finding it as hard as anybody within companies now not to be overwhelmed. And within Ireland, we have the highest rates of working from home and remote working. I'm not sure if it's a causation or correlation, but we're also reporting some of the highest rates of loneliness. So there's a sense of disconnect there between workers themselves. And what we're hoping to do, obviously, is, alleviate some of the suffering that's going out there. And one of the key ways we can do that is making the world more understandable for people, because the amount of information overload, where we have a lot of data coming our way, is only going to get worse. But also the amount of cognitive overload, where a lot of our assumptions are being challenged on an ongoing basis. This is also something we need to consider. How do we stay ahead of AI, and how do we make sure that artificial intelligence amplifies human intelligence? It doesn't just replace it. Well, number one, we need to encourage cultures that promote and make space for inquiry, for people to ask new questions, and for us to value the questions that are asked even more so than the answers, and having those answers in advance. We need to encourage dialogue, so real communication between people. Much easier said than done. That's the funny thing about soft skills. They're easier to talk about, but much harder to develop, and that takes time. I'm sure Tim will illuminate that for us as we welcome him as a speaker in a few moments. The other aspect I think that coaching comes in very usefully is from the point of view of reflection. we're working at a pace. There isn't a lot of opportunities to pause. We're going from project to project without a lot of time sometimes in between to wonder what we've actually learned, what we've learned that's different to what somebody else, even on the same project as us learned, as ourselves maybe have learned. And we're not always making the most of the learning opportunities that we have. So we're hoping that with this series on coaching, that we illuminate those opportunities more. And with people, I suppose, recognizing that some of the soft skills that are hard to develop do need a level of expertise and time to develop. And Tim, I'm wondering if I can hand over to you and you can help us identify what are those key skills. How do we maybe, having coaching cultures is an end goal for us all, but in the meantime, can psychological safety help us to prepare cultures that are coaching ready and are open and provide a safe space for people to have honest conversations that are not always easy? Can you help us with this maybe today?
Absolutely. And thanks very much, Fiona, for this opportunity. And you're very welcome, everybody. Appreciate this time. So yeah, a fascinating subject. And, as I was preparing for this webinar, which is all about, how psychological safety enables and creates the conditions for coaching ready cultures, I realized the more I was kind of looking into the preparation, the less time I actually had, because these are absolutely vast subjects. So we will do our best to cover very big topics in about 40 minutes. So please stay with me. I'll go quickly, but I also want to make sure that out of today, you are getting something quite practical and tangible that you can take away into your teams. So thanks again, Fiona, for having us today. My name is Timothy Mulholland. I am an organizational development consultant, and I work for a company called OMT Global. We are a global consultancy. We specialize in leadership development, team development, culture change, coaching, and organizational development and strategy. We're fortunate enough to work with a number of multinational big brand clients around the world and to partner with them. And along the way, we've managed to pick up a couple of awards as well. So the agenda today, as I say, a lot to cover, but I'm going to be quite practical and logical in how we answer the questions of how do we start creating environments and cultures that enable us to effectively coach. And we'll be covering a couple of items such as trustworthiness, psychological safety. And at the end of the talk, we'll have an opportunity to have a dialogue and a debate and a chat around what's landing for you. So as I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking, how do we get to that end point? And this concept of a ball of twine came up. And I don't know if you're anything like me, two left hands, I always struggle to find which is the end piece, which is the beginning piece. And I was trying to think, what's the end state, the aim or the objective of this talk? And that is, the effective coaching practice in cultures that support it. Okay. Now, as it happened, my little boy, Jude, who's 8 years old, he asked, Dad, can we watch Back to the Future? Because he had heard about this film from a friend of his. So I was absolutely delighted when he said this, because this is one of my favorite films or series of all time. So we watched Back to the Future over the weekend. And as I was watching it, I still had this question of the ball of twine of, what's that end point? And I came to the conclusion that I was actually asking the wrong question. We should be asking, where is not the end, but rather, where is the beginning? Where do we have to go back to in order to create the conditions for psychological safety, which in turn enables us to have effective coaching cultures? Okay. So before I go any further, I think it's really important, and we'll come back to that, to actually get a definition of what coaching is. And I'm sure many of you will know the work of Sir John Whitmore, and he uses this phrase. He says, coaching is about unlocking a person's potential to maximize their own performance. It is helping them to learn rather than teaching them. Okay. So what's really interesting, and the relationship between coaching and then the prerequisites, are a couple of elements that we need to be mindful of if we are indeed to create the conditions for effective coaching cultures. And these elements that Sir John Whitmore identifies throughout his literature are: number one, psychological safety, emotional intelligence, and trust. And I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, within the chat function, I'd like to ask this question. If you were to be doing a body of work, if you were to leave the webinar today and go, right, I'm going to start seeing what I can do to embed a coaching culture, and there's a program of works I need to do. And if these three things, psychological safety, emotional intelligence, and trust, were things you need to put in place, in what sequence would you put these elements if you had to do them in a logical sequence? Could I invite you to chat and tell me what you're seeing there? In what order would you place these levers? I'd invite you to chat and just tell me what you think the order could be. Laura, trust, emotional intelligence, psychological safety. Thank you, Laura. Mairead, trust, psychological safety, emotional intelligence. Great. Trust, psychological safety, emotional intelligence. Carmel, thank you. Philip, emotional intelligence, psychological safety, trust. Jean, trust, psychological safety, emotional intelligence. Yeah, brilliant. Really, really interesting. Lee, emotional intelligence, trust, psychological safety. Okay, so isn't that interesting? A number of different orders there. So what I'd like to call out at this point, just to be very clear, this is in a perfect world, in a blank page. If we were starting from scratch, there is some literature that suggests there is a particular ordering, and that would be, starting with emotional intelligence, moving into trust, and then into psychological safety. But what I do want to say is that this by no means suggests that this is a linear process. We can start depending on where we are at in any area. Now, for the purpose of today, I would agree that the order, as mentioned, emotional intelligence, trust, and psychological safety. And I'll give you a little bit of rationale as to why, because you might be going, I don't agree with that, and that's okay. The rationale for this is that emotional intelligence and trust have a causal relationship. In other words, my emotional intelligence, my self-awareness, me having a sense of who I am, how I show up, my strengths, my weaknesses, my biases, etc., have a direct implication and impact on the work I do in terms of generating trust and trustworthiness with the people I interact with. Likewise, trust has a causal relationship with psychological safety, because often what we talk about is trust is to the individual level as psychological safety is to the collective. And if I don't have the trust at an individual level, well, how am I to orchestrate a move towards a collective psychological safety environment? That's a big ask. So that's a little bit of the rationale, but I would like to say again, it does not mean we get to start with a blank page. If we are already busy with endeavors to embed psychological safety within our organizations, that is absolutely okay. But I would argue that sooner or later, it might hit a wall if at the end of the day, we have not gone down to the individual behavioral level, okay? And that starts at emotional intelligence. Okay, so if we are to consider, and we go back to the analogy of Marty and the DeLorean and going all the way back in order to go forward, this is where we say that emotional intelligence is where the work really needs to begin, looking at ourselves before we look at all that is around. Okay. Now, today we are not going to go into emotional intelligence. I'm going to assume, for the sake of today, that everybody on this call is highly emotionally intelligent. Now, that being said, again, using the chat function, I'd like to ask the question, what percentage of people believe they are actually self-aware? If you'd like to throw that into the chat, what percentage of people believe they are actually self-aware? And I hope you're not all Googling this, hence the delay. What percentage? The emotional intelligence, trust, so 50%. Philip, 75%. Emma, 40%. Lee, 40%. Mairead, 60%. Okay. So interesting. So in fact, 95% of people, generally speaking, based on the research, believe they are truly self-aware. I'd like to ask you a different question, and please throw this into the chat as well. Based on the research, what percentage of people are actually self-aware? Throw that number in. What percentage of people are actually self-aware? Mairead, 7%. Thanks, Mairead. Fiona, 45%. Philip, 20%. Laura, 20%. Susanna, 25%. Vivian, 25%. Okay. So the reality, which is rather concerning, is that it's actually only 10 to 12% of people are actually self-aware, truly self-aware, okay? Which is rather scary. So we can kind of see from a causal point of view, if we believe we are building strong trust relationships, if we believe we're able to orchestrate meaningful psychological safety, but we are actually only 10 to 12% aware of where we're coming from and how we are navigating behaviorally these interactions and environments, we need to do a little bit of work on ourselves, okay? So, as I say, we're not going to focus on emotional intelligence today. I'd like to jump into the two biggies here, that being trust and psychological safety. So, if we go to the next slide, trust. Trust is a really interesting concept because trust can mean many different things to different people. And in fact, not many people realize that there is actually such a thing as a trust equation. And this becomes really powerful when we start thinking about what is the work we need to do at the individual level in order to improve our trustworthiness. And the equation is quite simple. It's trust, is credibility. I know my craft. I know what I'm doing. It's reliability. I do what I say I'm going to do. It's intimacy. Now, intimacy means authentic, engaging interaction. It does not mean, sitting at the canteen and divulging your deepest, darkest secrets. That's not what it's asking us to do. If that's what you want to do, great. Err on the side of caution, but intimacy is simply about I bring my authentic self in a consistent way to our relationship. I'm a known quantity. You know what you're going to get, okay? Divided by self-orientation. So the self-orientation is really interesting because it's all about, is what people observe me doing in service of them, or is it in service of myself? Is it self-serving? And if we see a self-serving manager, leader, individual, it completely divides the strength of that equation, okay? So Fiona is actually very kindly at the end of this webinar going to be sending out a couple of materials. One of the materials she'll be sending out is a self-assessment on your trustworthiness. And I'd really encourage you to take this assessment. It takes about 10, 15 minutes. But what it will help you to identify is your trust wobble. Because in any one of these four variables, reliability, credibility, intimacy, and self-orientation, we all have a wobble. And what I'd suggest you do is look back over some of the relationships you have, some of the relationships where there's maybe been a breakdown of trust. Try identify what that common theme is. What part of the equation is letting you down? Do some soul searching around that. And then think about, well, what can I do about this? Okay. Because as I say, if our end goal is to be creating environments characterized by a coaching, leadership, and management style as enabled by psychological safety, it starts with the trust. It starts with emotional intelligence, okay? So please do that for yourself and ask a significant other what they think. It's always interesting to see what the partners and significant others actually think. Give it a go. So that's trust, a precursor to psychological safety. So we are now entering a psychological safe zone. So you cannot judge me from this point on. You can challenge me, debate me, but you can't judge me from now on. Psychological safe. Okay. So could I ask in the chat again, what elements do you believe make up psychological safety? How would you define psychological safety? If you don't mind, you can throw in keywords. You don't have a long, elaborate definition, but what are the keywords for you that show psychological safety? Openness, Emma. Yeah, thank you. Openness. Trustful space to speak out, Mairead. Yeah. Jean, tolerance. Absolutely brilliant. Can ask for help and admit mistakes, Fiona. Lee, empathy. Absolutely. Two-way conversation. Absolutely. Carmel for Wayne. Yeah. Two-way conversation. Absolutely. Listening to your employees, Laura. Yeah. Huge. Listening. Okay. Fantastic. So I'll offer up the Amy Edmondson's definition of psychological safety, and that is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Okay, that word interpersonal. This is all about vulnerability, and we'll touch on vulnerability again later on, but interpersonal risk-taking as characterized by vulnerability. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit deeper into what psychological safety actually looks like. And with credits to Timothy R. Clark on this particular model, which we use quite a bit, which I think is one of the best sort of illustrations of what psychological actually means at a behavioral level. So when we look at psychological safety, there are 4 stages of psychological safety. The first stage being inclusion safety, okay? That you are safe, that you are included, that you get a sense of inclusion when you join different teams and groups, okay? That you are part of that team and that group. Stage 2 is learner safety. You are safe to learn. You're safe to make mistakes, okay? That mistakes won't be, visited with reprisal, okay? Stage 3, contributor safety. And stage 4, finally, challenger safety. Now, what's very interesting about these 4 stages is what they talk about social exchange theory, okay? So what social exchange theory says is that at each stage, there is a reciprocity between the organization or the manager and the individual. And reciprocity means I give, and in turn, I give back. This is where we talk often about, contracting for performance. It's those contracts we have in place. And sometimes they are not nearly as clear as we'd like them to be. But this is in essence where psychological safety and contracting at the relationship level becomes really important. And what it looks like is this. At stage 1, at inclusion safety, the social exchange goes like this. I, as the organization or manager, encourage you and give you permission to be included in this team. And the reciprocity from the individual's point of view, the exchange, that in exchange, the individual will in turn respect, include themselves, and do no harm or threat within that environment. So it's a very humane exchange, okay? It's based in humanity and interpersonal relationship. And what's very interesting about this stage and stage 2 is this is an entitlement, okay? People are entitled to feel safe and in turn create a sense of safety. It's entitlement. So just bear that in mind. Stage 2 is learner safety. And the social exchange here is that the organization has what they call, the first mover obligation. The first mover obligation means that we as an organization encourage you and understand your need to learn and grow in your role. In exchange for the individual proactively taking up that opportunity to learn so that they can become the most productive contributor within their team. And that's where we segue into stage 3. And this is where something interesting happens. Stage 1 and stage 2 are entitlements, okay? They're entitled. We're entitled to learn, to grow. Now, what happens at stage 3 is it shifts from an entitlement to now it's based on performance. In other words, I've earned the right to, okay? So stage 3, what the exchange is, I give you autonomy with guidance says the organization, in exchange for the individual bringing results and performance. Okay, so this is where performance starts kicking in. Okay, and at the very last stage, which is challenger safety, is based on your contribution, based on your performance. We give you the airtime to be able to challenge the status quo in exchange for your candor. So what that means is organizations and teams, rather, that move into stage 4 understand that they need to have earned the right with respect to challenge, but that they do it in a candor or candid manner. And that means when we do something in a candid manner, if we think about, radical candor, it's about caring deeply and challenging directly. It's positively oriented. It means you come forward with challenge that moves us forward, not complaints, but challenges and solutions and ideas about what moves us forward. And what's really interesting about challenger safety is this is the threshold at which innovation starts taking place. This is where we start seeing moves towards improvement. Okay, really important. So if we look at this model, you'll notice on the left-hand side, on the vertical, we have respect, and at the bottom, we have permission. These are essentially the 2 levers that drive our progression through the 4 stages of psychological safety. And what happens if we have too much respect? Think about it for yourselves. If you really respect somebody, but you're not giving them permission to grow or to experience or to fail, it's quite a paternalistic relationship. In other words, it's almost like those helicopter parents they're always minding the person, but they're not allowing them to learn. They're not allowing them to be challenged. They're not allowing them to fail safely. And then we cannot graduate through the phases of psychological safety. On the other hand, if we give people just simply a lot of permission, but we don't have respect, what we're saying is, I'm quite happy to extract the value that your performance brings, but I don't show you respect. I don't engage with you. And if we think back to the trust equation, that intimacy, that self-orientation, this is where trust becomes such a deal breaker for the evolution and the embedding of psychological safety. Okay, so there's a lot of work and a lot of information that I'm downloading here right now. So I appreciate that there might be some questions which we will get to shortly, but this is a really great model in terms of understanding how we move towards that end stage, which is challenger safety, where the magic really starts happening. Now, out of interest, I'd like to ask you, what percentage of teams do you think actually ever make it to stage 4 challenger safety? If you want to pop that into the chat. What percentage of teams graduate to the level stage 4 of challenger safety? Vivian, 30%, Carmel, 20%, Wayne, Lee, 10%, Philip, 20%, Fiona, 10%, Emma, 45%. Interesting. Yeah, really good. Thank you for those insights there. So it is in fact 5 to 10%. Only 5 to 10% of teams actually graduate to stage 4 of challenger safety. Okay, that is a very, very low percentage. Okay, so again, what I'd say is that Fiona has also very kindly offered to share another resource we've got, which is on psychological safety. And that psychological safety assessment, I'd encourage you to look at that after the webinar. Okay, so moving on. What's really nice is this little model here. As leaders and managers, as I mentioned earlier, in the definition that was provided by Amy Edmondson, we highlighted the words interpersonal risk taking. And as I mentioned at that stage, that is all about vulnerability. This little model here is a model that each one of us should go into our workplaces with every single day. And this model is essentially a little organogram of how we can be more mindful of identifying, modeling, and rewarding acts of vulnerability, because this really essentially is where psychological safety starts taking hold. Again, in terms of that, well, I mentioned something earlier, that first mover obligation. As leaders, as managers who are wanting to bring psychological safety into our environments and our teams, we need to be prepared to be vulnerable and to model that vulnerability. We need to take that first mover obligation. Okay, I really encourage you. It's about choosing the moments for this. It doesn't mean we are vulnerable and falling apart every time, but choose the moments strategically where we can orchestrate and show genuine vulnerability that provides a signaling permission to our teams that they too can be open and honest about what's going on for them. Okay, so a very simple model: look, identify, validate, encourage acts of vulnerability within your teams. Okay, so a very quick recap. What psychological safety means is that you feel included and respected. You feel safe and supported to learn. You feel safe to contribute. You feel safe to challenge the norms. Okay, and this is where only 5 to 10% of teams are really allowing themselves to go, and that's where the magic happens. And all of this is done without feeling embarrassed, ashamed, or marginalized. Now, what psychological safety is not, okay, it's not coziness and comfort. It doesn't mean everything goes right. It does not mean that we all have to be close friends. Absolutely not. It is not an absence of pressure and challenge. In fact, a psychological safe environment should be one where there is the pressure and the challenge that brings the unlocking of that magic at that stage 4. It's about how we deal with the conflict that might arise. Okay. And it's not about always having agreement and cohesion. It is, in fact, having very disagreeable conversations, but having the maturity to traverse and navigate those conversations in a positive way. Okay. This is what it's about. So you probably all know this quote by Peter Drucker, which is "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And the reason I show this is that if, based on what this talk is about, which is about creating the conditions for coaching-ready cultures as supported and enabled by psychological safety, my challenge to you is considering those 4 levels of psychological safety: inclusion, learning, contribution, and challenge. How can you bring those as behaviors, as expected behaviors and values into your culture, so that almost by design, these 4 levels are part and parcel of your culture and your way of doing things in every interaction each day? That's the challenge. Okay. So again, going back all the way with Marty and his DeLorean back to the very beginning, this is all about the fact that it's about the emotional intelligence. It's about where you start. You need to be that change. You need to be the vulnerability. You need to be the model that opens up that first mover obligation and model these great behaviors. So thank you very much for your time, and we can hand it over to some Q&A.
Thanks so much, Tim. And I might open it up a little bit to the audience, and maybe even Susanna, call on you, Tim's colleague, to help me out with a little poll. Tim, you might be interested in this if you haven't heard it before. But I suppose one of the dangers we have is that we limit ourselves when we label ourselves or label other people. And one of the most common labels we apply to staff is they're either givers or takers. And we sort of see people in that fixed way, they're either overall contributors or overall they're taking from the organization in some way. And there was a study done last year where they looked at, okay, well, who are the highest performers? Do they tend to be the givers or the takers? So I'd be interested, guys, in your chat, in the chat, if you want to put up who you think tend to be the highest performers in organizations. Are they the givers, the takers? But I'll add one more category, and that category is the matchers. Okay, so the matchers are people who sort of, calibrate their own giving and taking quite carefully and make sure that they balance that out. So out of those 3 then, who are the highest performers, would we say, guys? The givers, the takers, or the matchers? I'm interested to see your feedback on that. So matchers being people who give and take equally, or at least try to do that. That's interesting. It's go towards the matchers and the takers. And actually it turns out that the highest performers are the givers. But the tricky piece is that the lowest performers tend to also be givers. But what distinguished between whether they were high performers or low performers, if they were givers, was it was the givers who knew when to ask for help that tended to be the high performers. And I suppose that's the paradoxical thing, isn't it? That we have to be open to being vulnerable in the first place in order to give people psychological safety. And I really thank you for differentiating there between what psychological safety is or isn't, because I think we may find ourselves, you know, expecting that employees should never be experiencing discomfort, and that isn't what psychological safety is. But I think it's also interesting to realize we have to open out our own categorizations of people to get the best from them, and not to label people either. So I'm wondering, guys, what aspect of psychological safety maybe could people share with us they think is the hardest thing to achieve? Is that encouraging managers to be vulnerable themselves? Is that increasing the self-awareness that any of us have? Because I suppose in a way we all like to see ourselves in the most positive light, and we tend to judge other people in quite a different way than we judge ourselves. Is there anyone who wants to share what they think is the most challenging aspect of achieving psychological safety?
So I'll jump in there just for a moment, Fiona, and say, one of the things we see quite often is actually one of the trickiest things is that it requires constant vigilance. It's the same with trust. It takes a long time to develop and foster this level of trust and psychological safety, and only a moment for a breach of psychological safety to occur, or a breach of trust, which really can set teams and individuals back quite a bit. So I think the challenge there is also the maintenance, the grace that goes with psychological safety and trust in our relationships and business.
Yeah, it's interesting because the chat there is indicating, first of all, raising this at leadership level for leaders to understand the importance of this is a key challenge. And I think that's partly because in some ways we define our talent quite narrowly. So the people who maybe make it to the managerial level in the first place tend to favor certain sets of behaviors. Would that be the case, Tim? They are managers who tend to be more assertive, more action oriented, and don't allow for the type of spaces and silences that we maybe need to create psychological safety.
Absolutely. And I think listening there about leadership awareness, I think another thing we see is, you've heard the phrase before that we are elevated into the levels of our own incompetence. And so often what is happening is we have individuals who are great individual contributors, and they become managers almost overnight sometimes, and haven't had the opportunity to truly develop into managers and leaders that understand the morality of putting yourself second and the team first, and what those behaviors actually start looking like. So that is also a very big factor in how we start creating psychological safety. It's that first mover obligation. And what does it really look like in very practical terms?
Yeah, Laura made an interesting contribution to the chat there, Laura, in you calling out, trust is something that takes a long time to develop, but as you said, Tim, can be really easy to destroy, very quickly. And I suppose at the pace that business and industry is occurring at the moment, it's easy for companies to make a misstep, isn't it? And to just misjudge something or miss an opportunity that might have been useful to establish or consolidate trust, because things are just happening so fast. And as I said, very few times to reflect. So when would you recommend, Tim, that companies make those spaces for reflection? Or, a performance management cycle tends to be, an annual event almost from a review point of view. Are there better ways? Are we really, needing to look at performance review and managing feedback in a new way now? Would that be part of it?
Absolutely. There's a couple of, again, a big question, but, you mentioned the word feedback there. And, I won't go into literature or research right now, but, it is about that feed forward mentality. If we are looking back all the time, how is it that we take performance and actually feed forward? What does it look like going forward? What do we expect going forward from a performance point of view? And what coaching conversations actually look like? I would also, say that to your question there, we talk about the pace of industry and the pace of business. And at the same time, we're talking about things like trust and psychological safety, which are very, humane type concepts. These are not things that we should be turning on or turning off as we walk into business. It's about, well, how do we live these values every single day within our families that we bring into the workplace? This shouldn't be something we turn on. This should be good humanity practice about how we treat one another. It's not a business concept. It's a humanity that we work with.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good observation, because it's up to us to make sure that any industry, be it insurance or manufacturing, is human centric. And humans, if we look at how we're designed, we are social creatures first before we are rational creatures. Any information that's shared by companies is going to be processed emotionally and socially before people actually apply any thinking, in a conscious way. So I suppose, it within our relationships lies the key for our productivity, and it is performance and productivity we need. I'm just going to go back to my slide deck, guys, just to bookend Tim's talk. Thank you so much, Tim, because I loved the stages of psychological safety in particular. That's a new one for me that, I'm really interested to learn more about, but I'm sure everybody took something different from the talk today. And the great news is, it is by working together that we make the world more meaningful and more understandable. And what we find now in the studies is that it's when we create collaboration that we alleviate a lot of the cognitive pressure and stress on people. 78% of staff at collaborative, or what they considered collaborative organizations, felt better equipped for the future, both knowns and unknowns. Because if we do compare our brains to AI, and I don't like to reduce our brains to computers, but the one thing we do, and we're intended or designed to do, is anticipate. We want to know we're going to be safe. We want to know we belong, as you said. That's the first stage of any kind of contract with the company. Well, we can't improve in our individual intelligence that much as individuals, but we can improve our collective intelligence a lot based on how well our coaching cultures can work and how much psychological safety we have. And I think, we sometimes forget coaching is a skill too that needs to be developed over time, but it's a key one, because managers, if you think about it, can't sit back on their expertise or knowledge anymore, because that's going to be outdated very soon. We have something called the half-life of knowledge. So half of what they know within 2 or 3 years within a lot of industries is obsolete. And as you said, Tim, we have promoted a lot of people based on that Peter principle. Really, they've been promoted beyond competence if one of their key competencies isn't coaching by the time they get to a managerial level. And you don't need to be a manager to learn how to coach. We can have peer-to-peer coaching as well. So there's a huge amount more we can do to make our communication and, I suppose, our worlds more meaningful and understandable, and boost the cognitive health and well-being of our staff if we embrace what psychological safety is, what it isn't. We understand the difference, and we also try and get our cultures more ready and our leaders more ready for what, a power skill really coaching could be, because we also have a multi-generational workforce that doesn't really, if we think about it, we're not as able to instruct, direct, and tell people what to do. As back in the day I started in business, I probably expected to be told what to do a lot more. Authority was, I identified with authority in a slightly different way. Nowadays people want to be considered equals and to be seen as, contributing right from the get-go when they join the organization. And the truth of that is that they are, because they probably have a more specialized skill set, but more one that can add value pretty immediately. So managers, not just do they need to be able to coach, but they need to be coachable themselves. And we need to be looking at, not to confuse the matter with mentoring, but reverse coaching, reverse mentoring is going to be something we need to have as a skill set for our companies to survive, I would suggest. So work is getting more challenging. As I said, it's getting more complex. So are our workforces. Our workforce is becoming, multi-generational, multicultural, and multidisciplinary, and we're going to depend on those multidisciplinary teams more than ever to solve what are sometimes called wicked problems. So, Tim, I hope you'll come back and join us again. But we do have a few events coming up in the next few months that maybe people would like to join us on. So, we'd like to add you to our mail shots if you have no objection to that. Or if you do object to us adding you to our mail shots, let me know. Otherwise, we'll consider that you've opted in. We'll add you to our mailing list. So we have some free webinars coming up. We'll have one in April on multicultural teamwork. And Tim, you hit on something really interesting, which was about it's how we see ourselves and how accurate that self-awareness is that's important. And equally within our own cultures, we do this little workshop for that team where we've run this webinar before and we'll run it again. Often we don't see our own cultures actually very accurately. Our own baseline perceptions of our own cultures are a little bit off. And if we can get that baseline assessment right, then we can adjust our settings much better for other cultures. So that will help us using a little tool from an IBM engineer who ended up in the HR department in IBM, a multidisciplinary person himself, called Hofstede. We look at his indexes around the different dimensions of culture and how we can manage that. And sometime in May, then we'll do a tool on the subject of, a session on the subject of collective IQ. And are there thinking tools that we can apply, like dialogue, within our teams that will get the performance that we wish? So, Tim, I hope you might even come back and join us, and this time it'll be your turn to engage in the chat, etc.
And just to say thanks so much to you and everybody that made it today. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for taking the time.
Not at all. We really, really appreciate your time. We always kind of leave a little bit of time towards the end that we know people are trying to snaffle a sandwich, perhaps, or, they're making up for the time they spent in us today during the lunchtime webinar. But we obviously, we're still open to any comments or discussion points. So if people want to continue using the chat for the next few minutes, I hope they will, because we would like to make the most of you, Tim, while we have you. And I'm wondering, when you're working with companies, how long do you think it takes to inculcate or instill a coaching culture? Are we talking weeks, months, years? What's your experience been?
Yeah, the experience that we have, culture change is significant. I mean, we're talking about people, process, technology. I mean, culture change hits everything. So, you're looking at an 18 to 2-year sort of trajectory in terms of culture change that really, and again, this depends, of course, on the size of organizations that you're dealing with, which obviously is a variable. But culture takes a long time. And I mentioned processes and systems there. I often talk about this leaky bucket syndrome, that it's one thing getting your existing culture and collective correct, but what are you doing as new people are coming into the organization? What does your onboarding look like? What does your induction look like? What does your interview process look like? That you can start at the very beginning, making sure that the expectations, that the social exchanges around psychological safety are well understood, so that as you're bringing people into the organization, they're not jarring with something that they were unprepared for. But culture change, to change that culture takes a long time, and it's continuous.
And I suppose one of my own observations would be not a criticism either, but, you can start anywhere. And probably the most logical place to start for companies is their own HR department. But more and more, I do see, emails from HR professionals where there's no phone number on the bottom of their email in the email signatory. And I wonder then, on one hand, they're trying to promote openness and safety, etc. But on the other hand, are they themselves open to the cultural change that's needed? And I suppose to give that message, are there inconsistencies there? Are there things that you see that are obvious? Okay, that's a low-hanging fruit there. If people can make those small adjustments and give these messages, even from the HR department itself, would that, engender coaching cultures more, or give results, reasonably quickly?
Yeah, I think as you were talking there, I was immediately thinking about, stage 3 of psychological safety, where it's about contributor safety. I think we're looking at organizations in very archaic ways. If we're looking at departments, how are we working cross-functionally to make sure there's representation, having meaningful conversations about what psychological safety looks at the horizontal level, not necessarily the vertical team level, but also across the SLT, the executive team leaders, HR. And look, I'm now going into the area of not opinion but experience. We cannot expect HR departments to have all the answers. If we think about organizational cultures, they're also made up of many cultures within different environments, depending on the size of the organization. And the best way to surface what those many cultures look like is through dialogue, is through communication and collaboration. To your point, Mary, sorry, Fiona, how do we get to that point where we are actually having these conversations and we know what the cultures are within the larger culture? So
yeah, because
people do not have all the answers. We can't expect them to.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I agree. And, it's everybody's responsibility too to instill a certain culture. It's not up to HR, even primarily, because, they're a support function to the business most of the time. But I do see where I see companies be more successful is when they actually open out the I suppose championing of coaching cultures, and they have more of their own staff involved in onboarding, and they don't leave it as the responsibility of HR, etc. And the other, I suppose, tricky piece is though that if you pick one subculture within the organization or one particular team that seems to embody a coaching culture and you set them up as the example to everyone else, in effect, you're almost punishing everybody else then. Really is about pulling out where you see any good behavior, celebrating that rather than celebrating a particular group.
Absolutely. And that's the signaling, pulling out those moments of great behavior, of vulnerability, is imperative. And you hit on a good point there. What is really manifesting in each team? It doesn't have to be the same, as long as what they're manifesting is moving in the direction of the performance goals and expectations we have as an organization, which is really interesting in itself.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. I think, there are challenges that hopefully will bring out the best in people. I think you've certainly brought a lot of really interesting concepts and models to our awareness today. So I really want to thank you for that, Tim. This is a free webinar. OMT have not been paid for participating. And, there was a lot of time and effort put in both by yourself and Susanna and Olivia. So I really want to thank you for that. And, from our point of view, we have great coaches that work with the Engineering SkillNet, and it's quite a personal thing to choose a coach to work with your organization to work on coaching skills. So we're always open to, hearing from those coaches what their experiences are, so that together, we can have a culture of collaboration with our member companies. And the IFS, SkillNet, feels exactly the same about their members. So if there was topics that you felt we didn't address today, or you'd like to go into those and investigate those a little bit further, folks, we'd love to hear from you, because there are lots of great providers out there and supports to your businesses that would be happy to come, I'm sure, and offer free webinars and a chance to interact. And Tim, we're more than happy to share any information, as I said, that you'd like to share with us. So thank you for that too, and much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. So thanks, everybody. I think, Tim, you can take a break now, well-earned break for your lunch. And thanks, everybody, for attending. We've been absolutely delighted to host this. As I showed you, we have other events coming up soon. And now that you're on our mailing list, you guys will be aware of that, and you're more than welcome to participate again. And I really, enjoyed today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Susanna. Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Olivia, behind the scenes in getting this together as well logistically. Thank you.